how to predict exposure. So we don't know how to predict how many bats are in an area. So it's very hard to evaluate the potential risk. The most likely thing that is available right now are acoustical monitoring before a facility is constructed, and there is some evidence that acoustical monitoring might give us some ability to predict risk, but it's very difficult because it's very hard to estimate just how many bats are in an area. The limited the studies that have been done and done well suggest that the bats that are at most risk are those migrating pre-roosting bats that I mentioned. There has been relatively high fatalities of Brazilian free-tailed bats that live in the southern plains, Oklahoma, Texas, and on into Mexico. It could be that there's just so many Brazilian free-tailed bats near hibernacula that they're not at any more risk. They're simply more abundant. But so far, we don't know for sure. There's some mitigation measures that show promise. There's some data that suggests there may be some acoustical technology that can cause bats to avoid turbines and facilities, and that curtailment of operating of individual turbines at really low wind speeds may also have some promise. Habitat, as I mentioned before, direct habitats are very low. The displacement impacts for most species are 0 to several hundred meters. The biggest concern is it could be much larger for prairie grouse. So far, it's sort of like the old real estate adage: location, location, location is important, and that right now looks like the best thing to avoid to reduce fatalities is to pick the right site, and once you develop the site in a way that reduces the chance of having turbines in areas where there's lots of birds. We don't have a good understanding of cumulative impacts, and I would define cumulative impacts as being impacts that reach the significance for a population. And so there's nothing really known about habitat impacts to other species. There was a concern in Vermont, for example, that wind facilities might impact black bear because they would disrupt some really important mass-producing forest areas. But that's the only thing that I don't think there's empirical evidence that really shows that would be an issue, but it's been raised. So that's it. Do you have questions? I'll be glad to try to answer them. No, probably in Wyoming. See,
Isn't it important to kind of keep this in perspective? I know in 2006, the American Academy of Sciences study showed that less than 0.03% of bird deaths caused by human feline activities were wind turbines. They go down the list, like cats are 1 billion, glass buildings 100 million. Down at the bottom, the turbines are responsible for less than 3 in 100,000 of these activities.
Right. Yeah, that's called the Perspectives study. We actually published that report, and it's one of the problems is we know more about fatalities with wind turbines than we know for anything else practically. But if you take the evidence, and it's not really good evidence, but if you take the evidence about communication power, large buildings, vehicular collisions, power lines, and so on, almost everything humans do will result in fatalities of migratory birds. There's almost nothing you can do that won't cause a fatality. So the importance of the fatalities caused by wind power should be put into perspective. And at the current level of development, it pales in comparison to the other fatality causes.
Do you guys do studies on the offshore impacts as well? I know they're somewhat different. I mean, they're more, I don't know if they're more migratory, it's stopover related issues. And do you guys do that kind of work too?
we worked on the Long Island Power Authority project. The issue with offshore, so most of the work's been done in Europe, and most of it is based on radar technology. The Europeans have not attempted to try to estimate fatalities. It's easy to figure out why they haven't done it, because we don't know how to do it. On the ground, I mean on land, if a bird gets hit by a turbine, it falls, it lands on the ground, you can actually evaluate the rate at which it'll be removed. So you can evaluate your ability to detect it. But when a bird falls on a moving surface full of predators and with predators flying overhead, the chances of actually sampling under a turbine is very difficult. So they've looked mostly habitat effects. With the Long Island project, which was dropped, we combined a number of studies, both aircraft and radar, and some modeling of risk to estimate, to predict what the risk would have been, and we would have hoped to have the chance to evaluate whether those predictions were accurate or not. But developing wind offshore is going to be a real challenge in terms of estimating potential impacts. But I think we can do that. The challenge that we haven't figured out yet, but it can be done, I think, as to how to evaluate those predictions. How can we actually truly estimate fatalities?
Yeah, I don't know if you've been tracking in the East. The big issue with bats is the white nose syndrome.
Right.
You see that? I mean, I know you mentioned earlier it's hard to keep track of populations, but what are your thoughts on the white nose having to do with the industry?
Well, I think the relationship white nose syndrome has to wind is that the biggest problems the industry has right now with bats are endangered species, like the Indiana bat, for example. And if white nose syndrome continues, there are going to be other endangered species that are going to cause the industry similar issues, because I'll just pick some numbers out here. If you kill half a dozen little brown bats at a wind facility, and the bat experts assume that there are, let's say, 200 million within 150 miles of that site, nobody's worried about it. But if you kill a half a dozen little brown bats at a facility, and white nose syndrome has eliminated almost all the little brown bats in the vicinity of the facility, say in the radius of 150 miles, then those 5 or 6 bats become much more important to the public, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and so on. So, and it'll just mean more issues that the industry can deal with.
This is sort of an aside, and if there's time, could you comment at all about where the FACA left off and what the status of that?
Right. Well, the Federal Advisory Committee made a recommendation to the Secretary of Interior. The Fish and Wildlife Service took that recommendation and converted it into guidelines and published those guidelines in draft form. There's a public review process underway right now. I think it ends May the 20th or 23rd, something like that. The draft guidelines are similar to what the Federal Advisory Committee recommended, with some really important exceptions. And so the Federal Advisory Committee, made up of industry, made up of NGOs, state representatives, it's quite a broad diversity of organizations. I think they agree that they're really concerned about the differences between the guidelines that the service has drafted and their recommendations. And so the service has agreed to hold a meeting, and it'll be next week in Washington, D.C. And I have no idea what's going to come out of that meeting. It'll be interesting. I'll be there, and I'm an advisor, so I'll just spend most of my time quiet watching it, unless I'm asking questions. But there are some major issues that will be discussed about what the guidelines ultimately is going to look like.
I'm sorry, regarding your presentation here, you had one slide where you showed the bat impacts at different projects, and I think I saw one that indicated curtailment. Was that to imply that there's only that one project where curtailment is going on? This data set is not up to date as of today, and I think there are about 3 studies that have been conducted where
curtailment is actually used now. And by curtailment, the evidence at the Mountaineer site indicated that the fatalities for bats seem to be concentrated around periods following weather events, but under very low wind conditions, I guess probably low wind conditions. And so the hypothesis then is that if you don't allow the turbine to rotate during low wind conditions when there isn't much electricity being produced anyway, and if that's when most of the bats are killed, then maybe that's a way to avoid significant bat fatalities at a facility. Now that has been tested in Pennsylvania and in I think it was Alberta, and perhaps one more site which is not coming to me right now. And there is some evidence that not allowing the turbine to begin rotating until I think it's like 6 meters per second or something like that actually does reduce the number of fatalities at the sites that have been studied. But you can imagine there would be a lot of other things you could do with that kind of information. Like, is there a way to fine tune that so that you don't have to curtail the turbines as much? And I heard something this morning, I think it was Dan, that said that as these turbines get larger, they become more efficient and can turn at lower wind speeds. Now, as the technology develops, the curtailment may become much more expensive to the industry than it is currently. So that's something that will have to be evaluated. But that is the one, there's two potential mitigation measures, and that's one of them that shows some promise.
Can I follow John's the question and then another question? As you described the FACA process and some exceptions to the consensus recommendations that will be entertained soon, could you summarize a couple of the most significant ones that you're aware of? How those issues exist right now?
I want to make sure that you didn't misinterpret what I said. I didn't promise the Fish and Wildlife Service would entertain those exceptions. I said they're going to meet next week. They may or may not entertain them. I don't know. But one example is that the guidelines generally call for 3 years of pre-construction, 3 years of post-construction data on all sites. And the Federal Advisory Committee was much more flexible than that. So the amount of effort was really a product of the risk that was determined. Another big difference, for example, and there are a number of differences, but another difference, for example, is that the Federal Advisory Committee tiered process allowed the developer to make a decision at the end of like the second tier that we can develop this without any further information. An example might be that you have a facility and you want to add a 150 megawatt facility, you want to add 25 megawatts to it. And it's going to be an infill process or adjacent process, and there's lots of information about risk, and it doesn't appear to be great. And so the Federal Advisory Committee said, well, under those circumstances, the developer should be able to go to the permitting process and develop a project without further study. Fish and Wildlife Service recommends that the developer go through all three of the pre-construction tiers and doesn't give them that off ramp from the study process. So those are two examples of bigger differences. Another big one for the industry will be that under the Federal Advisory Committee recommendation, one might not have to do post-construction fatality monitoring, but generally you would do 1 year of post-construction fatality monitoring, and perhaps 2, maybe more than 2, but 2 would be the most common extension of 1. That is, most would do 1, some would do 2, and rarely you might do more than 2. Fish and Wildlife Service really says, I think, that everyone will do at least 2, and some projects up to 5. So it's more a matter of the amount of information the Fish and Wildlife Service is recommending.